The pandemic made me really question so much more. There's going to be a winter of death from Biden. And in Canada, gosh, Justin Trudeau said that people who are anti-vaxxers are often misogynists and racist. So there's all this language that was used. And Brene Brown talks about how dehumanization always begins with language.
This sort of weaponization of belonging. I'd love to explore that.
Yeah, the weaponization of belonging is don't kill grandma, don't invite your unvaxxed person to Christmas, do the right thing. This language was all chosen by design.
Any other tips you have for people with this relationship with AI and social media?
Well, first thing is if you can get
Mark, what is up, man? Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Dude, I'm so happy to be on here getting to chat with you.
It's long overdue. I'm sorry it took this long.
All good, man. At the perfect time. I think so much has been going on in the world of health, the world of all technology, and I know that you've been crushing it. It's been really beautiful to witness.
Thank you.
How receptive people are to something that you've been saying for so long, but now there seems to be enough momentum of openness and curiosity that people are really desperate for help.
I agree. Thank you for those kind words. And speaking of when we first connected, it was during the height, from what I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, the height of the pandemic was you and I first met. And I think that time is where it was a shift. It was like an acceleration of awakening for people to realize, started questioning things they just never questioned before. Did you see that as well?
Yeah, I would have said that sort of the foundation of my work was questioning systems and how we get trapped in the life we're supposed to live. And then, I've always been interested in the health side of that. Like, what does that do to your body to be boundaryless, to have poor relationships? And during the pandemic, I was a pharmaceutical rep for 14 years, so I didn't know that I would come back to needing the knowledge of that world. I was exceptional at that, in that job, and I don't say that from an ego place. I was just really good at sales. And so when I went through a relational breakdown in my late 20s, that's when I thought, why am I so good at these other kind of relationships, but not romantic ones? And during the pandemic, I really just kept doing what I always did, which was ask questions. Okay, well, I started to read the studies that were about the products, and then I watched the marketing messages they were using, and they didn't align. Like the moment they said it stops transmission, I'm thinking, this isn't even a primary outcome of these trials. And if I was a rep, it would be illegal for me to promote these products without an indication, without any evidence. And so that's when my spidey senses started to go up. Ultimately, I started to wake up as a pharmaceutical rep, and it was, I would say, probably when I got a blood test done and my cholesterol was elevated. And then when I went to a GP, he said to me, well, I'm gonna have to refer you to a lipid clinic. And he never asked what I ate, So I dove deep into the science of cholesterol. And I gotta say, man, as someone who the very first job I ever had was actually selling a statin, it was like my mind kind of imploded. And it made me really start to question things, but the pandemic made me really question so much more. And it made me really study on a deeper level the use of psychological techniques and what they call in public health nudge tactics to increase behavioral modification, to increase compliance and adoption of a product, which of course from a societal level, using these techniques to get people to recycle more might be productive. But actually making it where you start to leverage shame and belonging and relationship, I didn't know what was going on, why I was so, in a way, angry, but it was because in hindsight, I could see that I've been a fierce advocate and also defender of what it means to really have productive, healthy relationships. And this felt like a very giant ethical violation. And it really was in any design an ethical violation.
And I think a lot of people had that moment in different ways and, different capacities. But I think when you look at the movement that's happening now of people questioning systems as a whole. That was COVID, like from 2020 on, was a massive awakening because they started seeing these holes in the story. And yeah, there's a lot to unpack of what you said, but kind of going back to the mRNA vaccines, is that we were going to kill the ones we loved. We were going, how could we? We would be horrible citizens if we didn't get this. But yet that's not what the science showed even then. And the people that brought that up were silenced, were deplatformed, were canceled. In hindsight, being one of those people that was brave enough to bring these things up in the midst of all of that madness, what does perspective of time, hindsight give you today, like of how people are now realizing it? And now the people that were shut down and canceled, now it's just known that it doesn't stop transmission.
Man, I mean, so many parts of that. I think the psychological, being able to process the information about the truth of the way it was mispromoted, I think would cause a lot of dissonance for anyone who actually, I don't want to say fell for, because if you actually took the product because of the marketing, that's exactly what it was intended to do. So you're actually a victim of unethical marketing. You're a victim of behavioral modification techniques. It's exactly what you were supposed to do, but in hindsight, we have to be able to process the reality and the truth. Because if we continue to pretend that what happened didn't happen, which I think a lot of people are trying to do, on one level because it just creates too much dissonance, but on the other level, I think there's a lot of shame about how we treated one another. And when you get hoodwinked and you fall for something, we can also have shame about that. And when I look back and I think of the marketing about, there's going to be a winter of death from Biden, and in Canada, I mean, gosh, Justin Trudeau, he said that people who are anti-vaxxers are often misogynists and racist. So there's all this language that was used. And Brene Brown talks about how dehumanization always begins with language, because when you use language to start to other people, you now set them out of a frame of sameness. And when they're not in this frame of sameness, we're willing to actually, for there to be violence and for there to be dehumanization on a grander level. And so when I look back now, I think not inviting your unvaccinated aunt to Christmas, we think that she's the only one who suffered. But actually, everyone suffered. There's so many fractures within our families, our communities, our cultures, and that's because they used it as a leverage point. And think about how ideologically it goes with your political perspective, with all these other ways we put each other in boxes. Mm-hmm. And so everyone has suffered from that. And then when I look back in hindsight, I think, well, there has to be some level of accountability to the people who, you can't say you were doing the best you could at the time, because I, as someone who was a pharmaceutical rep, who then also studied relationships, I understood it. I'm not an epidemiologist or a virologist, and I was reading the science going, well, this doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know, I think there needs to be a reconciliation of some sort. Maybe that's just a level of accountability that the US at least seems like it's moving towards.
Yeah, I think so. And I think we're having these conversations where people can kind of come out and not be afraid of being, punished online or in real life, right? I mean, the idea, if you think about it, it's just a wild time of people not being able to walk into a building in some cities and states without a card. I mean, it's just
It's like out of a movie. It's out of dystopian.
Yes.
Everything we're warned about. The studying of history, I thought that was fascinating. People would say, oh, here you go again about Nuremberg. And I was thinking, like, isn't that the whole purpose of Nuremberg, was for us to write down these principles when things get out of hand? Mm-hmm. And I think the term conspiracy theorist and just that easy language of right-wing extremist or left-wing extremist, it could be any, but it just instantly dismisses the information that we're hearing. Mm-hmm. And from an evolutionary lens, I mean, there's a book that was written about conspiracy theories and the evolutionary benefit of believing them, because when you're right, it actually protects you from some serious harm. And I think that might be true when we look back at COVID.
Yeah, and hopefully, it was a mass experiment of how quickly people just complied, right? Rolled over,
crazy.
and just kind of gave up everything in the name of whatever, this marketing campaign that was, shoved down our throats. And now we think of it's like in the past, and there's these two groups of people, the amount of people that created, ended relationships, ended friendships, cut off people from their family because of choices that they made in their own health, decision between themselves and their doctor, themselves and their family. And then you think, okay, most of those people, they're fine now, right? They're going to the holidays, they're hanging out with those people. So I'm curious of the psychology of that, of like, okay, this was so important to you, but now you're not checking their status now. But then it's still actually going on, but it's probably obviously a lot smaller of a group of people. But I had a telehealth patient tell me just a couple of months ago that she still can't see her grandkids because of her vaccination status with her healthy, not immunocompromised grandkids, which you could really look at the statistics of kids. I mean, there was really no healthy child, probably with a few exceptions, but vastly no healthy child died from COVID. And the idea that these parents are still clinging to this completely outdated, even marketing tool, it's wild to see it still clinging for some people, right? Like they just can't admit that this was wrong.
Well, that's the product of the mis and disinformation from the people we're supposed to trust. Like public health and doctors, the trust in them is at an all-time low. I mean, in Canada, direction from public health was to have sex with a glory hole, like cutting a hole in a sheet. Mm-hmm. Like that's from the people who are supposed to be making leadership decisions. Wear masks, don't wear them, surgical masks, cloth, like there was so many inconsistencies, and I think of that family, the grandkids not being able to see their grandmother, all because of misinformation from the people they're supposed to trust. You see people wearing surgical masks at airports, wherever, and I think about it every time I see it. I don't make fun of them because it's not their fault. They're actually doing what they were taught to do, and I think when you become that obsessed with something, and you then, let's say, shame other people for it, you actually end up doubling down on the perspective because the amount of shame you would have to process can be too much. So we're like, it's like any ideology. And there's some research looking at harmonious passions versus obsessive passions. And this idea is that, like, let's say someone's obsessed about exercise versus it's a harmonious habit. The people who are obsessed about it, if they miss a workout, they actually don't get the perceived benefit from the exercise when they do it because there's such a constriction and control around it. People who are obsessed with climate are less likely to recycle and more likely to commit a terrorist act. So you think about that in the context of religion. You think about that in the context of pro-vax or whatever it might be. I just never thought I'd live in a world where proposed liberals would be pro-vax, pro-war, pro-censorship. And that was, I think, for a lot of us, really hard to reconcile psychologically because we're going, am I living in an upside-down world?
Yeah. Well, it was. And you mentioned this misinformation, disinformation. The people that were so overly using those terms were the biggest purveyors of it, right? It's like the Orwellian 100%. Doublespeak. It's like what you accuse others of, you are guilty of. Knowingly. So I saw a piece, I think it was out of the Reason outlet, and it really talked about how the left's handling of, and I would call it the progressive left's handling of the pandemic dislodged a lot of reasonable center-left people, traditional Democrats in the States, traditional liberally minded people, libertarian, whatever you want to say. There's a lot of people that are center-left naturally. And because of how the progressive left handled the pandemic, both in the United States and in Canada and beyond, it dislodged a lot of the wellness world as well. Is that a lot of us that were health conscious people were like, what? Like, this is so illiberal. It is the antithesis of liberal ideas, meaning liber, freedom. And that's why it kind of really, I think, shaped a lot of the election is this Maha movement, which are not traditionally right-wing people, but are just independents that are like, this didn't add up. And I heard someone say recently, it's like, okay, conservative, and that most of the conservatives today are, what are they conserving? They're conserving liberal ideas. They are conserving. We are conserving liberalism, and that's where we're at today. This realignment politically, and is it the same things happening in Canada? I would assume.
Yeah, we just voted in another liberal government, and so we've just had 9 years of them. And it kind of, you know, what I think about the U.S., at the core of the ethos of U.S. culture is liberation because of the separation from England. But in Canada, we're a Commonwealth.
Yeah.
And if you look at all the most extreme responses to COVID, they tended to be Commonwealth countries, you know, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. I mean, we were we might be one of two, but I know we're definitely, there's a very small number of countries that actually had a flight mandate. You couldn't even catch a plane if you were unvaxxed, so you couldn't even leave the place that was dehumanizing you, which is, you know, immobilization to the nervous system is extremely traumatic. And there is no investigation into Canada's COVID response. There's no opportunity to hold anybody accountable. And I think, you know, because the argument about the United States would be that people are too individualistic, that there's too much of this raw freedom. But as someone who felt like their freedom was really impinged, I really love that that is true. But you know, any form of like individualism in its extreme can be toxic. Yeah. Collectivism in its extreme can be toxic. Mm-hmm. And so this is just like romantic relationships. It's this balance of individuation with togetherness. And that's what makes really successful relationships. Much like what makes very successful relationships is not just diversity, which, you know, culturally, that's been a massive conversation, but it's diversity of thought. But here you have all these progressive lefts talking about diversity, but when it became diversity of thought, there's absolutely zero psychological safety to disagree. And I think, as you said, that's where they lost. I don't actually even think that the quote-unquote conservatives or Republicans won. I think it's that literally the Democrats lost it for themselves. They probably could have inserted, like they do anyways, but voted in, Robert Kennedy and had a chance at actually winning, you know? And I don't, you know, it all is the way it is now, but I agree that a lot of conservatism, which is happening in Canada too, a lot of people who just like, there's no home for me. If there was just a massive rise of centrism labeled that, I think it would start to take over the world in the best way. Diverse thought, which creates richer ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. Diversity of thought, freedom of speech, personal choice. These again are classically liberal ideas. I mean, people need to realize that. And I don't even love the term like liberal and conservative anymore because it's not. It's not. I mean, the progressives today are neo-Marxists. They're not actually very liberal at all. And it's quite different. We talk about these things in The Art of Being Well because it's about societal wellness, right? These are inextricably linked to physical, like the macro impacts the micro and vice versa. And this impacts, and something you talk about is this sort of weaponization of belonging. I'd love to explore that. And so people can maybe have some aha moments today of like, okay, I'm going to learn from this and so it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, the weaponization of belonging is the use of things like, you know, don't kill grandma, don't invite, you know, your unvaxxed person to Christmas, have each other's back, do the right thing. So the have each other's back infers that if you don't do it, you don't have other people's backs. This language was all chosen by design, and, you know, I can't, you know, when you look at how was this all coordinated, that's where people get into conspiracy, because how was the exact same marketing language used throughout the world? You know, and so have each other's back, do the right thing, which infers that the other is the wrong thing. And, you know, I had close friends, family, say to me like, you're very selfish. You're selfish that you're even talking about this stuff. It's very privileged that you're not choosing to get vaccinated, which I thought was a really fascinating use of language, because when I thought about, okay, well, what is the highest population of unvaxxed people in the United States? it was people of color and lower socioeconomic groups. Well, who were doing all the delivery, a high proportion of the delivery jobs and things like that? It was the lower socioeconomic groups. And so the privilege really is the ability to choose to get it or not, but when your work is on the
You'd
line.
lose your job if you didn't, which many, yeah.
Exactly. So is that a privilege? I just thought that was such a fascinating use of information. What I also found was that the people who are really in charge of managing how propaganda is used and behavioral modification techniques are the people in mental health. Yet they were some of the most captured people by the narratives, which I think is just, when you look at the pathology of what makes someone go into services of taking care of other people, it's usually because they had a childhood where they developed the skill of being hypervigilant about other people's feelings. They wanted to manage their environment. That's what makes good therapists. That's what makes good coaches. That's what makes good doctors and nurses and physios and whatever. And so if you're given the choice to hold on to the truth, but that truth is going to disrupt a system and a relationship, are you going to hold on to that, or are you going to let it go to keep the peace? And I see this same thing happening with all ideologies, the conversations about gender. We'd rather just say biological sex isn't real so that no one feels hurt, instead of holding on to just a fundamental truth and then navigating whatever is at the core of these challenges, which are mental health challenges, and being able to just tell the truth about that. So I think when we actually start to see how, if you're authentic and self-express, and that actually compromises your family relationships, your community, and your greater culture, you're more likely going to silence yourself in order to be part of the group. And this is how humans develop. And Gabor Mate talks about that all humans have two needs: the need to be authentic and the need to belong. But when authenticity threatens belonging, belonging wins. So you see all these people who spoke out and continue to, like you, where when they say something that goes against the grain, it takes all these other people and they go, oh, Dr. Cole is saying that. Okay, well, maybe I could say something. And what happens when another person says something and then another is that it reduces the social risk. But the first person to go is, in my opinion now, the most courageous. Because think about all the people who have challenged all narratives, they tend to get canceled first, as you were talking about.
Well, and then this is such a special time in my mind, for whatever you think of, the listener out there, if you don't like Bobby Kennedy, if you don't like Jay Bhattacharya, these were guys that went out there and spoke very inconvenient truths when it was the height of, they lost so much. And you may not like them, you may not like everything they're saying, but what they're saying now, what they were canceled for is now just common knowledge. This is stuff that people want to ignore and not look back because it's going to make them look wrong, because you canceled people and shut up family and friends. But they were right.
Yeah, and people don't realize that when you start to leverage conflict in relationships, you increase inflammation. So in the research where they look at couples who have high levels of conflict, but they're not actually fighting and they're sitting beside each other, their nervous systems are in a dysregulated state. So most people, I would say, are still recovering from the trauma of the weaponization of connection. And we don't often even know that, but we're experiencing anxiety, maybe we're depressed, maybe we're overwhelmed, maybe we're starting to develop autoimmune issues, and we're not realizing that when you're in a high state of cortisol, when you're consuming lots of news, when you're getting notification after notification, when the blue light from screens is impeding your production of melatonin, which is a precursor to so many other hormones, it's like we don't realize that the collective experience of all these things is causing our bodies to be unable to heal. That's why you think of what is the simplest piece of health advice that seems to be circulating now is just aligning your circadian rhythm, like getting your feet on grass and looking at the sun in the morning. It makes so much sense that the prescription to health is to return to some sense of a biological foundation, because we are these biological beings operating in a digital world. Does it mean that we need to erase things like phones and computers? Obviously, that's not going to happen. But if we don't decide our relationship with technology, it will decide our relationship with it. and we're not going to like what it comes up with, because the behavioral scientists, there's thousands of them who consult social media and work with these technologies, work for the companies, and their whole job is to make sure that you are addicted to these things.
And you tested this on yourself, right? With you looked at your blood sugar, right? Your insulin. So can you walk us through like what?
Yeah.
Again, everybody, just context for this. This is impacting someone's physical health, but on a macro level, societal wellness. We're part of society, and your relationship with, whether it's your closest circle or it's social media and the greater world, I want people to have this realization that these things impact your biochemistry just as much, if not more in some cases, than the food or a supplement or whatever thing we think of. But it's a lot more nebulous, right? Because these are relationships and they're complex, and you just can't just quote unquote stop it or quit consuming it because it's so everywhere. What was your experience with your health, your blood sugar levels, for example, when it came to social media, this little experiment?
Yeah, so this all started because I was, I had well over 1 million followers on different social channels, and I just had a lot of anxiety when it came to using those platforms. And that wasn't something I always had, but I started to look at the relationship dynamics that people have with social media, and I started to see like, oh, these platforms relate to you in a way that is very much similar to an abusive relationship. So nothing will ever be enough. So there's no amount of content that will ever be enough. It always wants more from you. The other thing is that as someone who creates content, which is anybody who has a profile, because it doesn't have to be business related, the content you're creating is being assessed not just by strangers, but people you know, and also by a non-human entity, an algorithm. And it's basically saying, is what you're saying worth hearing? And the algorithm and what actually is worth seeing and being heard is always a mystery. You'll never know how to win. And virality is really fascinating because you'll get some virality and then they'll take it away. So it keeps the psychological hooks, this is very similar to toxic relationship dynamics. And so when you think about just how your body is going to relate to this thing that you can never know how to succeed, there's a lot of walking on eggshells kind of feeling. And so I left social media for 6 months. I was going to leave forever, but while I was away from it, I started to feel obviously much better. Now, what's fascinating is when we don't know how to relate to something, we often push it away, because we don't know how to be in relationship with it. And that could be healthy with things like alcohol or drugs. But what I notice with people in relating to one another is we often need to actually leave the relationship in order to know how to relate to the relationship. And it's actually by leaving that you learn you can. So then staying is through choice. So if you can't leave a relationship because of financial things or whatever it might be, then are you really truly going to feel free to be yourself in that relationship? This is sort of at the core of codependency and self-censorship and all that. That's why I think we play out a lot of our childhood wounds in the context of what happened with COVID. It just exasperates it with fear. But this can happen with any ideology, but this can also happen in the context of our relationship with social media, which I'll explain. So I leave it and I'm starting to feel a sense of relaxation, but I'm really fascinated in studying it because I'm thinking, this is really interesting, like our nervous system in relationship to this thing that always wants more. There's got to be something there. So I interviewed Dr. Stephen Porges, the founder of polyvagal theory. And he says to me, Mark, your nervous system is not designed to have a version of you available 24 hours a day for social criticism and to be vulnerable to social risk. And I thought, shit, that's it. Like when I go to bed in the year 1850, we have this conversation in front of a crowd. When we go to bed, yeah, there's people talking about it, but this won't exist all the time. So what is it like for the nervous system to think about there's something always happening about you? And again, you don't have to be a business. I just think it's exasperated when you are a creator or a business or a teacher online. And then I started to look at, okay, well, if that hypervigilance is constantly happening, there's a study that looked at couples, people on dates, and when they had their phone face down on the table, they were less vulnerable in their conversations because part of their unconscious mind is always thinking about what's going on in the rest of the world. Right. So then I'm taking care of my in-laws. They have a couple horses. And I'm living in Idaho at the time where, hey, during COVID, freedom reigns. It was chef's kiss. And so I'm hanging out there and they tell me to take care of the horses. Listen, I'm not a horse guy. That's probably pretty obvious by looking at me, but my extensive horse training is essentially watching Yellowstone. And rap music merging with country music was a great thing for me. So I get this idea. I'm supposed to bring them into the pasture, then feed them. But I get this idea that I'm going to change the order and put the food in the pasture and then go get them. So while I'm putting the food out, I look over at the stalls and the two horses are like spinning in their stalls. I'm not qualified for spinning horses, just to be clear.
I grew up with horses, so
yeah,
I am probably a little bit qualified for spinning horses, but not to toot my own horn.
I did not. I grew up in the inner city of Calgary and I had a dog. So I go over to the one stall of like the nicer horse and I bring it in. He's, super excited to eat. I go to get the second one. And when I open the gate, she hits her nose into the gate and it flies open. So I go and I like put the harness on her, the rope on her harness. Again, these are all not horse words. And I put it on and she is like tugging on it. And as soon as we walk out of the stall, she does a giant buck kick. And I'm like, I'm gonna die. I bring her over, get her in. I'm terrified. I put her in and my wife is with our son and she walks around the corner of the barn and she looks over at me and I'm like, just got out of the pasture trying to recover. She's like, what's wrong with you? And I'm like, I just almost died. She's like, oh my God, it's so dramatic. And I'm wearing a CGM and I'm fasting. So it's about an hour later that I get home to my phone. And I'm like, oh, I got to check my blood glucose. And it is 140 an hour later. So my body has said, you're going to die, get some sugar in your blood, let's activate muscles. And it made me think about a time I got an email and also another time I got a notification of like someone very angry at me for what I was saying during COVID. And my glucose at those times went to 140, 150, 160. And I started to think to myself, can the body not differentiate a true threat of injury from a threat of belonging? And it can't. And there's research to look at the impact of loneliness and it being at the same level of something smoking like 1 or 2 packs of cigarettes a day in terms of inflammation. And I started to also look at the research on the impact of social media use on inflammation, and it showed that people who use social media more have higher cumulative levels of inflammation. But this also made sense to me when I started to think of things like the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, that the more cumulative traumatic events you have, the more likely you are to develop autoimmune. And I just started to think to myself, are we all creating, which I think from a collective societal level is making sense when it's tracking to high fructose corn syrup, glyphosate, all these inflammatory foods. We have inflammatory environments. We have inflammatory, emotionally inflammatory social media. We have the impact of the inflammatory use of devices. And then we have how they hook into our dopamine pathways and our reward systems. And then we also have, from a cultural perspective, how gentle parenting has led to people who don't have emotional resilience and essentially are very fragile. So even their ability to navigate emotional distress is not even there because it hasn't been developed. And of course, we can blame that on gentle parenting, but we can blame it on a lot of things. But essentially the coddling of people, and I've thought about this a lot during COVID, that the level of capacity that we have for difference with cancel culture was being determined by the people with the lowest capacity. And although I think that is changing now because we're allowing people to be enraged by difference. We're allowing them to be enraged by Bobby Kennedy or Jay Bhattacharya, where I would say objectively a healthy culture would always have been open to that. Even when I was a rep, you would have debates where there would be one person who agreed and one person who disagreed. And Jonathan Haidt talks a lot about this, how universities in the book, The Coddling of the American Mind that he wrote with Greg Lukianoff, where they talk about how universities are debates between people on the far left with the middle left. And so I think about how all of this collectively impacts things like baseline inflammation, but blood glucose, which I know that's a deep level of interest, all of that for you. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on sort of the
Yeah,
threads
I mean,
that I drew
it's
together there.
wild. The threat, actual threat and perceived threat, or like the impact that belonging could have on our biochemistry. I see that on a small relational level with telehealth patients with a few different levels. Is that the relationships at work, if it's that unhealthy work environment, I see that impacting their health. I see that with their romantic relationships, their friend circles, and of obviously social media. We have some people, I prescribe them exactly what you did for 6 months. Sometimes it's not 6 months, but just to give them at least an aha moment to how do you feel whenever you're not constantly scrolling that FOMO inducing content, and they don't realize how it's impacting their REM and their deep sleep. They don't see how it's impacting their nervous system and their
Huge.
inflammation levels. So what was that 6 months like for you? Like that 6 months seems like probably people can't go a couple minutes without checking their phone, let alone a day or a week or a month or
Yeah.
6 months. What was that like? Did you have some withdrawal symptoms?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think though my level of distress that I was physiologically feeling, emotionally, I guess too, that I was experiencing that anxiety. And when I started to, because at the core of anxiety, it's really an inhibitory emotion. So it's when you're not capable of feeling or expressing some of your other core emotions. And I found that because I wasn't listening to the call that I needed to leave, that suppression and ignoring of my truth was causing me to feel anxiety. And there was a lot of, my business perceptually was dependent on social media. So you think about a relationship, it's like, well, if you are dependent on someone financially, then you can't leave. So there was that. I'm gonna not be able to pay rent, pay for my family, all that kind of stuff if I leave.
Yeah.
So it hooks you in. And I found also what was fascinating about social media is that the moment that you put in a conversion message, like, hey, go sign up or I'm enrolling, then the algorithm would actually downgrade the post. And now when I explore how do I physiologically feel being back in relationship with it, I actually feel great because it's by choice, and that choice might seem small, but there's that saying that the opposite of trauma is choice. Wherever you're not in choice, you're going to be in inflammation. And it's like we're using alcohol to resource, to numb. And so, there's that saying that the wrong question is why the addiction, the right question is why the pain. And so I really start to think about at the core of why people are so addicted to these things is one, it's by design. And two, it's that we're actually trying to use things like social media and that distraction, numbing, sort of unconscious just consumption. We're trying to use it to feel safety, to feel connection, but it's an endless pit, because we all know we've never been more connected than ever. I mean, gangster 90s Mark Zuckerberg, I love his new style. He talks about how human connection is his core value. And I'm like, that's impossible because you guys don't even let your own kids use these platforms. And shouldn't that say more to us than anything, that the people who have the deepest knowledge about these things?
Yeah, can you touch on that? Because I've
them?
heard execs talk about this. So the people that research this the most or the most involved, they don't let their kids. What do you know of how these people that are in charge of social media, how they treat social media in their homes with their families?
Well, in the social dilemma, they touch on that in that documentary where they talk about how they would never let their kids use that stuff. I believe it was Steve Jobs who talked about his kids weren't using iPads, things like that. Which just makes a lot of sense. There was a whistleblower just released a book, I can't remember her name, but she was talking about how they would track when a girl would delete a selfie and then advertise makeup to her. And I think that is such evil, and we all wonder why our kids feel the way they feel. I don't think any child, at least below the age of 16, should have a smartphone, should have social media. Now, of course, that offers an interesting dilemma because I have a 2-year-old, so I'm not dealing with teenagers. I know you have teenagers. So it's like, well, when teenagers are asked, would you get rid of your smartphone? They say no. But when you say, if all your friends did, would you want to? And then they say yes. So it just shows you that, again, there's that belonging piece that's really important. There's a really cool phone that I use as a side, like I'll put on, I'm away from my smartphone right now, just call me on this number if you need me. Most people don't call you because, come on, that's too old school.
Yes, I've heard of it.
But it's called the Light Phone, and I love it. That company is
so
awesome.
it is just
They're great.
basically an analog phone. It just calls out. Is that basically what it is?
They're smart. They made it so that it does all the things that you would need from a smartphone, but it has no possibility of doom scrolling. So everything on there is intention-based. So they have texting, calling,
Oh, I didn't know they had that
directions,
much. So that's
podcasts,
nice.
music, and they have a camera. Yeah. And there's another one I just got just so I could test it out. It's called the Minimal phone. It looks a lot more like a BlackBerry, which those keyboards are kind of cool, but I really like the Light phone. I've interviewed the CEO, one of the co-founders, and I just love the core ethos of the product. And they've been doing it for years. I just think for everybody, there will be this analog movement. I think there is a massive one, and I think we're sort of at this interesting precipice where people will either upload themselves to the cloud or come back closer to Earth. I think from a health perspective, you'll need more of the technological hacks to resolve this. But I think for the people who are craving things like meditation, connecting in community, in person, farms, eggs, chickens, all the things that you see as funny memes. Like it's like my dream is buying 20 acres with friends and, living on a farm.
That's my life, pretty much. I had all my in-laws, they're all Los Angelinos, and they all during COVID, primarily, some a little bit before, all have moved out. And I caught Los Angelinos in the wild because they bought like 100 acres, live on a regenerative farm now, and it is basically
that's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's amazing.
So do you live on a regenerative farm?
I live next down the road from one. I don't live on the farm, but we're all within 5 to 7 minutes of each other, and it's like this one big Southern California and Western Pennsylvania. It's a fun life for sure.
It's amazing. My in-laws also have a farm in Idaho where the horses are, and that type of life is just so. The body wants that.
Yeah. Yeah. So the parallels of which you pointed out of how social media, the algorithm is with a relationship is, I never thought about it in the way that you articulated it so eloquently. And I think it's going to be a big eye-opening moment for many people. So you decided to go back into that relationship, but it was a choice this time. How did you what's the boundaries with social media look like now when you brought it back in your life?
Yeah, so for the last 3 days, I didn't post because I can feel the pull to have to. And so I honor and acknowledge that, but I recognize that in order to be unhooked from it, I just have to be okay creating when I want to create. I think of people like Stephen Pressfield and Rick Rubin really talking about how art is created for the sake of art. And Rick Rubin talks about how the audience always comes last. And I love that concept that what you're creating in the world can't be dictated by what people want from you. And isn't it always through those acts of trailblazing, through those acts of trusting, that things actually work out? There's a strange paradox about that because when you're trying to dance for the algorithm, you lose connection to yourself. And so for me to come back into it and recognize when I've done that and when I still want to do that, or if I do something and then I'm like, oh, did that really come from an authentic place? So there's a lot of constant information that I'm gathering because we've never been here before.
Yeah.
So partly it's that, I don't really respond to very many DMs or comments, and that's because I never want to create the expectation that I'm always available to you. The other thing is that I will not enter into some state of activism where someone is like, why are you not speaking about, posting about, da 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 da, when they have like a private profile with a cat picture? You know, I could give two shits. So during COVID, I decided, I made a rule that I would not collude with someone's own loss of clarity and critical thinking.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to insulate them from the truth of their own self-abandonment. And I wrote a book with my wife called Liberated Love, and the whole premise of that book is that truth is in service of love. Like, I miss you, we're not doing good, I'm frustrated about this. Like, that's the material that must be worked with. And that's like disagreeing with someone politically or ideologically. That's actually what creates intimacy and connection. And that's actually what creates wisdom. You know, there's always a third truth that we come to when two truths collide. And it's seemingly always wiser than the first two that it started with. And I think when we enter that level of curiosity, the other thing too is that, you know, when you go to your home feed, and your home feed is like all the squares, and the squares have, you know, what the algorithm believes you want to see.
Yeah.
And no matter how many times I put not interested in booty, I always get booty. Which, it's probably because, you know, it can sense that you hesitate a couple extra seconds on the thing, even though you put not interested. And so I recognize that the algorithm is specifically trying to capture me. So to me, it is a game now, where I'm like, you will not hook into me. It's like being in a relationship with a narcissist, you know, where you're just like, no, like, I'm not gonna feed your supply. And that's ultimately what these things are. They're profit-driven, so they monetize your attention. So when you realize that you're giving your attention away, then now you can take it back. And this is true about all things to do with relationships. You are responsible for yourself. You're responsible for where you direct your attention. You're responsible for the thoughts you have in your mind. You're responsible for what you consume. And you have to start making the connection that the people you relate to and how you relate to them and the information you're consuming is directly impacting your physiology.
Yeah.
It's not free. None of it is free. And I think we're all feeling that because, look, we're all on fucking Ozempic, we're all on antidepressants, we're all on all these things, not seeing that, you know, when there's that beautiful saying that when a flower fails to grow, you don't blame the flower, you change the environment. And we are responsible as adults for curating our environment. And isn't it crazy what that does for your health when your nervous system is asking the question, do we have our own back first? And if the answer is no, insert inflammation.
Yeah.
That's my complete theory.
Yeah.
What do you think about my theory?
Neuroimmunoendocrine axis. That is what's dysregulated. The nervous system, that intersection between the nervous system, the immune system, i.e. inflammation, and the endocrine system are hormones, cortisol, blood sugar, all of it, thyroid hormones. Okay, so a few thoughts that that came up as you were talking. Okay, going back to the 6 months, you mentioned, okay, your job, like your livelihood, how you provided for your family, how you paid the bills was largely due, if not exclusively, driven by social media, right? So what was the reality? That was the fear, but when you walked away for 6 months, did it all fall apart? Like, what's life like completely unplugged in that way?
Yeah, so it was fascinating because, of course, it had a correlation to the frequency of people being exposed to, one, my messages, what I talk about, my podcast, all that kind of stuff. So there definitely was a correlation. But I expected that, you know, I expected that I needed to learn how to survive without it, and that allowed me freedom to express on it. And you know, when I was speaking out, which speaking out was not anything crazy, I was just saying, what the hell is going on? Like, why are they promoting this product to pregnant women when there's no data? That violates the precautionary principle. Like, I thought I was taking crazy pills, which I'm sure you thought you were too. And so when that impacted my business big time, I was growing 50 to 100,000 followers a month. And then as soon as I was speaking any form of truth, it was just like, bam, zero. And it made me start to think about how, the algorithm can decide your relevancy within a second. You know, and as we're now, the algorithm is promoting more conversations about health, like, you know, your work, thank God. So it definitely impacted it. And it was actually listening to people like Gary Vaynerchuk, where he was saying, you could have the perspective that social media is destroying kids and destroying, and he's like, and you might be right on some level. He said, but it's like anything, you have to decide how you're going to use it. And that's very true. It's like, could I curate my feed so that it was only expansive? Could I only be in a relationship with it, try my best, of course, where it was actually contributing to my life? And I have a really good friend who's a relationship coach, and he said to me, Mark, what would have been like the ultimate dream of what someone could say back to you when you were expressing yourself during COVID? And I said, oh man, I think it would be just like validation that my experience was legitimate. And he's like, look, I understand that there is a survival-based correlation to your self-expression. Like you actually felt an existential threat. And I was like, yeah. And he's like, so like, what would have been the ideal? And I was like, yeah, I think just to say like, we hear you, it's okay, it makes sense that you feel the way you feel. We're in an Uber at this time, by the way, which is really funny, because the Uber driver's listening to us talk, and I'm sure he's like, what the fuck? And Mike says to me, his name is Mike Elliott, he says to me, Mark, that sounds a lot like your relationship to your mom. And I was like, oh God. And I was like, oh, there's something there. That's interesting. And so I'm sure the Uber driver's like, what is happening? Is this like a Netflix show on psychotherapy?
Yeah, right. Where are the cameras at?
Yeah. And I get home and I say to my wife, like, oh, there's something there. Like Mike said that to me and it just really resonated. And she's like, yeah, that makes sense. And I was like, well, why didn't you say something? She's like, well, no, I'm just putting it together too. And I started to see that the thing that we most want from social media, like the wound in the way we relate to it, tends to be what we most wanted from our parents.
Wow.
One or both. Yeah, and I started to see that I had projected, my mom is an incredible woman, but she was overwhelmed when I was young, 3 kids, etc. And so I felt like, that I was the youngest. I felt like I wasn't always validated in my experience or important enough. And so I started to make that correlation. Also, my mom and I, interestingly, had very different beliefs about COVID. And so that was a separation that occurred just from a growing up perspective. I had to, individuate from her belief-wise. And so coming back to social media, I had all this awareness. So when I came back to social media, I was like, no longer am I pursuing this from social media. I've survived without it, so I can let it go whenever I want. But it is actually an incredible place where conversations are happening.
Yeah.
And when I left, thousands of people messaged me saying, can you leave your stuff up? Because I have posts saved. And there was really like 10 years worth of writing and thoughts and processes. And I just thought, there's actually a lot of beauty here. And I missed out on a lot of the beauty because there was so much darkness. And I got consumed by so much of that because I was afraid. And I started to also see that when I communicate on social media from a dysregulated place, I'm just perpetuating the same division that I'm purporting to try to resolve. And so that level of responsibility on my own nervous system state and the way that I communicate, like, is this productive? Is this in service of love? Which is this in service of truth, of course, too.
Oh, this is powerful. This is so good. And the way you put things are just impeccable. So you're kind of renegotiated, you kind of healed your relationship with it in a way, and you know how to operate with it in a way that it is a double-edged sword, right? That it's a massive blessing, right? Connecting with people around the world, those messages, you're elevating people's awareness, you're edifying people with your content. But it's so easy to get trapped, right, into this sort of the other side of that double-edged sword. So you mentioned you have a better awareness, it sounds like, where you know to stop and to not post and kind of detach. Any other tips you have for people to like maybe implement into their life with this relationship with AI and social media?
Well, first thing is if you can get a second phone, which I know is obviously based on resources, but if you can get a second phone that's like a light phone, and then start to implement breaks from access to social media. There's other cool tools like I've heard of, I haven't used it, but the brick, where it actually locks you out of, and you have to be close to it to access your social media. You can also turn your iPhone into like a more of a minimal style phone. I forget what that app's called. So there's all those strategies. Essentially, you want to start to leverage and build strategies so that it's not hooking into your dopamine. So this would be a lot like quitting alcohol. You know, actually taking 1-2 days a week where you don't even use social media. People have timers on their apps. That can be helpful, but I find that most people just end up
circumventing it, yeah.
Yeah, so it's, for me, at the core of it is recognizing that if you are not in choice with it, you are dependent on it. And so now it's determining a lot of not just your attention, but also your biochemistry. Like it's gonna have a big impact on it. And your body's gonna say, I don't have choice in relationship to this thing. So psychologically, you're now creating a doorway. And that's how I like to see it, is like, it's now an entry point for extraction, which means now you're going to be likely becoming addicted to it. And it's going to create doorways for other addictions. You're not going to have as great discernment about food, about connection, about boundaries, about self-expression. So it's not just one area where you create a leaky boat. It will leak into every area of your life. It's like if you're only at 30% of your capacity in one area of your life, we think that we can just like put that over in a box. That's not true. You're going to inhibit everything. And when people start to feel a sense of choice, they feel a sense of pride. That's why boundaries have this symbiotic relationship. If you're boundaryless and you set a boundary, that's like throwing a Hail Mary the first time. Because when you set a boundary, you say, I matter, my values matter, I matter. And then what happens is you put a deposit in your self-worth bank. And then what happens is the next time you set a boundary, it feeds self-worth, and then self-worth feeds boundaries. And that also actually is incredibly attractive. Because when someone has access to the word no, their yes comes from an authentic place. Now we think, okay, well that's great when I'm in relationship with people. Now they know that when I say yes, I mean yes, and when I say no, I mean no. Like when someone asks you to help them move, let's be honest, you probably don't want to. So just say that, you know? Or say, I don't really want to, but here's the reluctant truth. Because now you're getting access to truth. Now, we think, again, that just has an impact on the relationship with the person. But no, it has a massive impact on your own body first, because you're creating this experience of trusting yourself. You don't express yourself and set a boundary just so the boundary gets agreed to. That's a nice outcome. But you actually do it to hear your own voice. The healing's in the hearing, not in the reception of it. So now when I look at that relationship, one, you just want to insert choice where you don't have it. You really want to maximize your ability. This would be like any form of addiction. You want to maximize the separation of you from it. So creating, when you wake up in the morning, and I'm guessing you're probably an advocate of this, when you wake up in the morning, maybe your phone is your alarm clock, fine, but like make sure that the first thing you do is go outside and look at the sun and put your bare feet on the ground. That for me is a habit and a ritual. I get a coffee and I just go sit outside, put my feet on the grass. And in the winter, I even put my feet on the snow, which is a little colder. But I think the water is actually better for activity.
Sure.
So there's that aspect of it. And then at night, this is an interesting one because I've actually been playing with this where I'm like, okay, am I falling into the addictive space or I'm actually in choice? And so for me, I think there probably needs to be about an hour before you go to bed where you're not using it. I'm still playing with that timing, but the one thing I have done is worn the red
blue light glasses. So blue light blocking glasses.
Yeah, and that has helped. You know, I couldn't believe when I implemented these strategies how much my deep sleep went up. And REM. Like it was dramatic.
I mean, blue light blocking glasses, we try to get telehealth patients to do 2 hours before, which is, you know, they're not always doing it. But yeah, we see the biggest score jumps of REM and deep sleep improvement, like these deep restorative sleep for people that don't. These levels where your body heals the most and you can feel the most rested and energetic the next day when it's about 2 hours prior for most people. And yeah, if you have to, and that half is so, like, we shouldn't even be using that word for most times. It's not half, but you choose to, or you are sucked into it. is wear those blue light blocking glasses, and they have to be the really cool Bono, like deep red colored glasses. Yeah.
The red ones,
For
yeah.
nighttime. Yeah. So anyways, this is great. This is really good practical tips for people. Anything else come to mind that you implement in your life with this new relationship with tech?
You know, a lot of it also came from discernment about food.
Interesting.
So and it was, I always had this sort of like, I was always big into exercise, fitness, sports growing up. And it was because I was chubby when I was like in grade 5, grade 6, and then I was like, I'll never be chubby again. But there wasn't a healthy relationship to that, you know, like most things. It's like, I'm never gonna do it again. So again, we push away instead of learn how to relate. And so I quit drinking, I quit, you know, any form of drug that made me numb to myself. And then I started to see that sugar was what I was using, and I learned to use that very young, eating like gummy candies, drinking chocolate milk, things to like soothe my feelings as a kid of not feeling maybe like I fit in school, etc. And so I really started to, a couple years before I left social media, I started to look at glucose, and I wear a continuous glucose monitor, usually for a couple weeks every 3 months. And that level of awareness of what impacts my body, I mean, I had no idea you could just change the order of how you ate, go for a walk after you eat. Like there were all these magical things that no one taught me, and where society seems to have been, although it's changing, obsessed with cholesterol, which has so much controversy in terms of the sort of the mainstream medical model of how it perceives it. I was like, man, insulin resistance is the thing. And so when I started to look at that and then how technology impacts insulin resistance, that's where I started to see that you couldn't have one without the other. So interestingly, it actually started with the level of discernment I was creating about diet, because I accessed such a deeper level of choice. Then I removed what I was addicted to. So when you remove what you're addicted to, you expose the feelings that are creating the addiction. And that's when it started to reveal to me that I was also using social media from a similar perspective. I just didn't know.
Well, and there's so many aspects to this. Like you're right, that the stress of that FOMO-inducing, like that war with the trolls in the comment section, that whatever, the FOMO-inducing content is going to raise cortisol, which will impact blood sugar, perpetuating insulin resistance. It will dysregulate what we talked about, that neuroimmunoendocrine axis. But I think you brought up a good point in passing that I have seen play out in people's lives is when they are stressed and they are in that sort of consuming mode of this endless vortex of content, they're also choosing foods that don't love them back more easily, right? Because they're kind of stress eating or eating unconsciously. Did you find that as well?
Yeah, like I just find consistently that people who do not access choice in one area of their life are not accessing it in most. So you know, if you look at like the science of willpower, it would be essentially the same thing, that as you're consuming without, you know, really consciousness about what you're consuming or even deciding how much you're going to consume, you're really going to lose access to choice in every area, you know, and I think when we actually just take responsibility for that, because what is it ultimately that all these things hook into, all these products, all these, you know, drugs, is they hook into self-abandonment. And I think that the opposite of consumption is creation. So if you find yourself heavily consuming things, you're probably suppressing creativity, and you're probably ignoring your purpose, your voice. So the more you actually take that desire to scroll and you put it into writing, starting a Substack, starting a podcast, and it doesn't have to be anything huge, you know, that's this thought process, but you have to get it out of you. And I think when you do that, you witness yourself, and in the witnessing of yourself, you don't need to numb it, because when you abandon yourself, you create pain. And what soothes the pain of abandoning your soul is all the things that are addictive.
Yeah. Well said, my friend. This has been a blessing of a conversation, man. Before we go, the podcast, you know, it's called The Art of Being Well. At the end, we have Your Art of Being Well. First question is, what's the absolute worst tasting food you've ever eaten? But you do it for the health benefits. It's a healthy food, doesn't taste great, but it loves you back.
Oh, man. That's tough. It's a toss-up between Brussels sprouts and cod liver oil.
Good choices.
Cod liver oil is so good.
But I would put cod liver oil over Brussels. You could do Brussels sprouts like good, like in the oven, baked, right? But like
This is what everyone says about
Yes.
Brussels sprouts.
have you had it that way? Because if you're just like steaming those things, then I get you. But you could
You know, I keep trying them because everyone who's obsessed with Brussels sprouts always says you got to make them with like maple syrup and
yes,
bacon.
bacon,
I'm like, well,
raisins, yeah.
I could dip
Cranberries.
most things in those and it would taste better. But yeah, you know, now for the first time I had a Brussels sprout that wasn't awful. But cod liver oil, you can't dress that up in anything.
No, it is what it is. That's a good answer.
Ugh.
Do you take supplements? And if so, like what are two maybe out of the box, lesser known supplements that you take?
I take the product from Body Bio.
Do
you know that?
Yeah,
The liposomal.
phosphatidylcholine.
Yeah, I take that. And what would be something? I mean, I'm probably pretty standard. I take vitamin D3K2.
Okay.
And I take, you know, I do take psyllium every day. That's not out of the box.
Yeah,
though.
but
What
no,
am I
but hey,
saying?
but it's one of those things that's tried and true as far as the research is concerned, but people like sleep on it. So it's a good answer. I don't think anybody's ever said that, so that's a good answer for sure.
Hey, sweet.
Yeah. What is some place that you have been to in the world that should be on other people's bucket list?
Oh man, I'm reluctant to share this, but I'm going to share it, which is Tofino in British Columbia on Vancouver Island on the West Coast. It's this
Okay.
surfing, small fishing town that has amazing restaurants, and it's hard to get to, and it's one of the most beautiful drives, and it's got 1,000-year-old trees, and
Wow.
it is one of the most majestic, beautiful places I've ever been in my life.
That's amazing. Where is it at again? It's in BC, but where?
Yeah, Tofino, Canada,
Oh.
in British Columbia, on the west coast of Vancouver Island.
In the West Coast of Vancouver. I think I've told you this before. My brother-in-law, he's the only Los Angelino that's not in Pennsylvania. He's in the Sunshine Coast, Seashelt,
Oh, so
Roberts
beautiful.
Creek. It's like, it is beautiful, so beautiful. All right, next question is, what's a book you've read? It could be fiction, nonfiction I need to add it to the book club. I have the Art of Being Well book club running list. What should I add to the list?
Oh, man, a foundational book for me, stepping into my passions and my purpose, was Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Is that in your list?
No, it's added. Consider it
And then
added.
I think the best book I've read from a cultural perspective in the last 5 years was The Coddling of the American Mind. I think that is just like,
So good. You mentioned that earlier. I definitely have to read that. My friend, where do people go to learn more about your work? All the things. Where do they go?
yeah, thanks for having me, man. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
And thank you to the audience for trading your time to hear me. I'm so grateful and honored. You can find me at markgroves.com for all my personal stuff. And then on Instagram, mainly I post on @CreateTheLove. I have the Mark Groves podcast as well, and you've been on that. And so, yeah, I appreciate everyone trading their time for listening to us.
Mark, come back anytime, man.
Appreciate it.